There is a specific kind of broke that almost nobody talks about, and it is the most dangerous kind because it does not look like broke at all. It looks like a stable job, a nice house, a reliable car in the driveway, two incomes, maybe a couple of kids in decent schools, a yearly vacation, a retirement account that gets a contribution every paycheck. From the outside, this looks like success. This looks like the dream that an entire generation was promised would be the reward for working hard and playing by the rules. And from the inside, for an enormous number of middle-class households, it feels like running on a treadmill that someone keeps quietly turning up. More income arrives. Somehow there is never more left over. A raise comes through. Somehow the gap between income and expenses stays exactly the same width it always was. This is not an accident. This is not bad luck repeating itself across millions of households simultaneously. This is the result of a specific set of traps, financial, psychological, and structural, that the middle class is uniquely vulnerable to in a way that neither the poor nor the wealthy quite experience the same way. And today, we are going to expose every single one of them. My name is Mike, and the thing that pulled me into studying personal finance obsessively in the first place was not poverty and it was not wealth, it was this exact phenomenon. Watching people who were doing everything they were told to do, who were responsible, educated, employed, disciplined in the conventional sense, and still feeling like they were one bad month away from real trouble, despite a household income that statistically should have produced comfort and security. The middle-class money trap is real. It is widespread, and it operates almost entirely below conscious awareness, which is precisely what makes it so dangerous and so important to drag into the light. So let's drag it into the light. The first trap, and arguably the most foundational one, is something I call the qualification trap, and it is built directly into the structure of middle-class life. Here is how it works. A certain income level qualifies you for a certain mortgage. A certain mortgage qualifies you for a certain neighborhood. A certain neighborhood comes with certain schools, certain social expectations, certain unspoken standards for the car in the driveway, and the vacations you take, and the activities your kids participate in. Every single qualification triggers the next expectation, and the entire structure expands to consume almost exactly as much as your income allows it to. This is not a coincidence, and it is not weakness. It is the system working precisely as it was built to work. Banks do not lend you what you can comfortably afford. They lend you close to the maximum that the math allows, because the math is designed to maximize what gets borrowed, not what keeps you financially secure. And the middle-class household, qualifying for more with every raise, every promotion, every dual income milestone, keeps stepping into bigger qualifications without ever stepping back to ask whether the bigger qualification actually serves their life or just consumes the room that used to exist for savings. Now, here is something that should genuinely unsettle you, because I do not think most people have ever run this specific number. The single largest hole in the middle-class financial trap is the house itself specifically, the belief that a primary residence is an investment in the same way that a stock or a rental property is an investment. It is not. A primary residence is a consumption item that happens to sometimes appreciate. The distinction matters enormously, because an actual investment generates income or cash flow while you hold it. A primary residence generates expenses, property tax, insurance, maintenance, the opportunity cost of the down payment, the interest on the mortgage for the entire duration you live in it. Appreciation, when it happens, only gets realized when you sell. And when you sell, you almost always need to buy another place to live, which absorbs most or all of the gain right back into another property. The middle class has been sold the idea that the house is the foundation of their wealth, when for the vast majority of households, the house is actually the largest consumption decision of their entire life, dressed up in the language of investment. This single misunderstanding redirects enormous amounts of capital that could have built genuine income, producing assets into a structure that mostly just shelters the family while quietly consuming money the entire time. And the trap deepens further when you consider how the typical mortgage amortization schedule actually works in the early years. For the first several years of a 30-year mortgage, the overwhelming majority of each monthly payment goes toward interest, not principal. You can pay a mortgage faithfully for 5 or 6 years and barely move the needle on what you actually own. Meanwhile, that same interest payment every single month is flowing directly into a bank's revenue rather than into anything that builds your net worth. The house feels like progress because you are making payments and the balance is technically decreasing. The reality, in the early years especially, is closer to renting from a bank with the added burden of maintenance, taxes, and insurance layered on top. The second trap, and one that I think is even more psychologically insidious than the housing trap, is what I call the comfort treadmill. The middle class is uniquely positioned to experience this because they have just enough income to make every upgrade feel reasonable and just enough financial pressure to make every upgrade feel necessary. The car that is 6 years old starts feeling old, not because it stopped working, but because the neighbor got a new one. The kitchen that was fine for a decade suddenly feels dated because 3 friends just renovated theirs. The family vacation that used to mean a road trip to visit relatives starts to feel insufficient compared to the international trips appearing across everyone's social feed. None of these individual upgrades feel reckless. Each one is justified by genuine improvement in comfort, genuine social context, genuine reasonable affordability given the income. But the comfort treadmill never lets you arrive anywhere. There is always a next reasonable upgrade. There is always a next normal expectation just slightly beyond where you currently are. And the household that keeps stepping onto each new rung of the treadmill never builds the gap between income and expenses that actual wealth requires, because the gap gets consumed by the next entirely reasonable improvement before it ever has the chance to accumulate. Let me give you a number that I think will land harder than anything else in this video. The middle-class household that earns a combined income of $120,000 a year and saves the national average rate of roughly 5 to 7% will, over a 30-year career, accumulate a fraction of the wealth of a household earning $80,000 a year that saves 20%. Same career length. Lower-income household ends up wealthier, not because they earned more, because the gap between what came in and what went out was protected rather than consumed by the comfort treadmill. This is the single most counterintuitive and most important fact in this entire conversation, and it is one that almost nobody making decent money has ever actually sat down and calculated for their own household. I want you to actually do this calculation for your own life, not as a hypothetical exercise, but as a real diagnostic. Take your household income. Calculate what you are actually saving and investing as a percentage of it, not what you intend to save, what you actually moved into savings or investments last month, and compare that honestly against the comfort treadmill items you have added in the last 2 years. For most middle-class households, that comparison is uncomfortable. It is also the most useful 5 minutes of financial reflection available to them. The third trap is debt that looks responsible because everyone around you carries the same kind. Car loans. Furniture financing. The credit card that gets paid mostly but not entirely every month, carrying a small balance that feels manageable. Student loans that were taken on with the explicit promise that the degree would produce income sufficient to absorb them easily, a promise that for an enormous number of middle-class graduates simply did not materialize the way it was supposed to. None of this debt feels dangerous in isolation, because everyone around you carries similar debt, and shared normalcy is one of the most powerful psychological forces that exists. But the interest on all of this quietly, continuously, every single month is capital flowing away from the household and toward a lender. Capital that will never compound into anything productive for the family that is paying it. The middle-class household is often simultaneously paying interest on multiple forms of debt while contributing to a retirement account, which means they are losing money on one side of the ledger at a faster rate than they are building it on the other. This is not always visible because the retirement contribution feels like progress and the debt payments feel like maintenance. But the math underneath both of those feelings tells a very different story. If you are paying 8% interest on a car loan or carrying a credit card balance at 20% while simultaneously earning an average market return of 7 to 10% in your retirement account, you are losing the arithmetic comparison every single month. The debt interest is a guaranteed, certain cost. The investment return is an average, uncertain gain. Paying down high-interest debt aggressively is, in almost every realistic scenario, a better guaranteed return than anything available in the market, and yet it is the move that gets deprioritized constantly. because the retirement contribution feels virtuous and the debt payment feels like an obligation rather than an opportunity. Here is something that deserves to be said plainly because almost nobody says it plainly. The middle class has been systematically taught to delegate their financial decision-making to institutions that profit from that delegation. The financial advisor who recommends the products that pay them the highest commission. The mortgage broker who qualifies you for the maximum the bank will allow rather than the maximum that serves your actual life. The retirement plan administrator who defaults you into funds with fee structures that quietly erode your returns over decades while you assume the professionals have your best interest at heart. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is simply how incentive structures work. The people advising the middle class on their money are, in a significant number of cases, compensated in ways that are not perfectly aligned with the financial outcome of the household they are advising. And the middle class, busy, trusting, and generally not trained in financial literacy at any point in their formal education, tends to accept the guidance at face value because questioning it feels presumptuous or beyond their expertise. Closing this gap, actually understanding the basics of how fees, commissions, and incentives work in the financial products you are sold, is one of the highest leverage things a middle-class household can do. And it costs nothing except the time it takes to learn. A retirement fund with a 1% annual fee versus one with a 0.05% fee does not sound like a meaningful difference on paper. Over 30 years, on a substantial balance, that difference can consume tens of thousands of dollars of your retirement that simply transferred from your account to the fund manager's revenue, silently, year after year, without you ever noticing a single transaction that felt like a loss. There is also a trap hiding inside the very concept of the dual income household, and I think it deserves real attention because it has become almost universal and almost universally unexamined. When both partners work, the household income rises, and the household expenses almost always rise alongside it in proportion. Childcare costs that did not exist before now consume a significant percentage of the second income. A second car becomes necessary. Work wardrobes, commuting costs, the convenient spending that comes from two exhausted working adults with less time to cook, clean, and manage household logistics, all of this expands to absorb a meaningful percentage of what the second income contributes. Many households, when they actually sit down and calculate the net financial benefit of the second income after accounting for all of these associated costs, discover that the actual gain is dramatically smaller than the headline salary suggests. This is not an argument against dual income households. It is an argument for actually running the real math rather than assuming that a second salary automatically and proportionally improves the household's financial position. I have seen households calculate this honestly and discover that the second income, after taxes pushed the household into a higher bracket, and after childcare and commuting and convenience costs were subtracted, was contributing a genuinely small fraction of what the gross salary suggested. That does not mean the second income is a mistake. It often means the household has never actually examined where that income is going. And that examination alone frequently reveals room to redirect a meaningful amount of it toward savings rather than toward the costs that quietly grew around having two incomes in the first place. Now let me talk about something that ties almost all of these traps together, because I think it is the psychological root underneath the entire phenomenon. The middle class lives in a uniquely painful zone of social comparison. The genuinely poor are not typically comparing themselves to billionaires. The gap is too large to feel personally relevant in daily decision-making. The genuinely wealthy have largely escaped the comparison trap because they have already met or exceeded most conventional markers of success. But the middle class lives in constant, immediate, granular comparison with people who are extremely similar to them, the neighbor with the same job title, the sibling with a slightly nicer house, the friend group where everyone is roughly matched in income, and therefore everyone notices exactly what everyone else is doing with their money. This proximity makes the comparison feel urgent and personal, in a way that comparison with distant wealth never does. And the spending that results from this proximity comparison is some of the most psychologically compelling and financially destructive spending that exists, precisely because it feels completely reasonable. The wealthy person buying a luxury item is making a choice from a position of established security. The middle-class person matching a neighbor's purchase is often making a choice from a position of compressed margin, where the same dollar amount represents a meaningfully larger percentage of their actual financial flexibility even though the price tag on the receipt looks identical. You are not trying to live like a celebrity. You are just trying to keep pace with people who are, by every visible metric, exactly like you. So, what actually breaks these traps? Because diagnosis without a path forward is just a more articulate form of anxiety. And that is not what I want to leave you with today. The first move is recalculating your actual house affordability independent of what you qualify for. Run the numbers on what percentage of your take-home income you want housing to consume. Most financial researchers suggest staying meaningfully under 30%. And aggressive wealth builders often target 20 to 25 and treat that number as a hard ceiling regardless of what a lender is willing to offer you. The second move is naming the comfort treadmill explicitly inside your own household. Before any lifestyle upgrade, ask out loud whether this is something you actually want or something that has started to feel necessary because of what is happening around you. That single question, asked consistently, interrupts the automatic escalation that the treadmill depends on. The third move is auditing every debt you carry and calculating, in real numbers, what it is costing you annually in interest, then attacking the highest cost debt aggressively before increasing any discretionary spending. The fourth move is becoming financially literate enough to ask hard questions of every advisor, broker, and institution that profits from your financial decisions. You do not need a finance degree. You need to understand fees, incentives, and the basic difference between advice that serves you and advice that serves the person giving it. And underneath all of these specific moves is one larger shift that I think matters more than any individual tactic. The middle class trap survives because it operates on autopilot because the qualifications, the comparisons, the upgrades, and the debt all feel like the natural and reasonable progression of a responsible life. Breaking the trap requires turning off the autopilot. It requires deciding, deliberately and specifically, what your household actually wants its money to do, rather than letting income, qualification limits, and social proximity make that decision by default. That decision, made consciously rather than by drift, is the single difference between a household that earns well and stays stuck and a household that earns well and actually builds something that lasts. The middle class is not doomed to this cycle. The traps are real, but they are not permanent. And they are not even particularly complicated once you can see them clearly. What makes them dangerous is precisely that they are invisible while you are inside them. You are not failing if you recognize yourself in any part of what we talked about today. You are simply someone who has been living inside a system that was never designed with your wealth building in mind. Now you can see the system, and seeing it is the entire difference between staying on the treadmill and finally stepping off of it. If this conversation made you look at your own financial life a little differently, then subscribe. I make these every week honest, sharp, no fluff conversations about the real mechanics of money and the traps that keep good. Hardworking people stuck despite doing everything they were told to do. Hit subscribe and stay with me. And if today made you wonder what is actually possible once you start recognizing and avoiding these traps, the next video takes this conversation even further. We are talking about how to become financially free, even if you are completely broke right now. The exact sequence, the exact mindset, the exact moves that take someone from nothing to genuine financial freedom, laid out clearly and honestly. It is the natural next step after everything we just covered. It is right there on your screen. Click it now. I will see you in the next one.